Have you ever struggled to make peace with yourself, to treat yourself with kindness, compassion, and love in a way that we know we should show to others? When we can get to that point with ourselves, it can reframe our work, our relationships, and our lives. My guest today is motivational speaker and author Mike Robbins, whose latest book, Nothing Changes Until You Do, A Guide to Self-Compassion and Getting Out of Your Own Way, helps individuals and audiences look at how they undermine their own good intentions through self-deprecation. Mike will give us some insight into the challenges of opening up to ourselves, being okay with the imperfect person we find there, and taking that person into the big world out there. All this and more with Mike right after my public speaking tip of the week here on Full Speech Ahead, so stay tuned.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last! Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Each one of you has your own platform. Mine is a stage in a studio. Yours is wherever you are.
Welcome to Full Speech Ahead, the program where we look at communication in all its many facets with an emphasis on the spoken word. I'm your host, public speaking coach Milo Shapiro from Public Dynamics. Before we get to my guest today on applying self-compassion throughout our lives, here's my public speaking tip of the week. One of the questions I get most is, do I have to use humor? There's an old saying in the National Speakers Association, you don't have to use humor in speeches unless you want to get paid. But what if the topic doesn't lend itself to humor? Well, then you have to dig for it. I asked the client, who's a medical researcher, if I could share his story, and he said I could as long as I changed the topic of his research. So let's say he was studying Wilkinson syndrome instead. Ted was going to be speaking at a conference where he was an expert on Wilkinson syndrome, and when he first contacted me knowing he needed speaking coaching, he said, I've been all over your site, I know you have the improv background, you just have to know there is no room for humor in this speech. I said okay, and he came for a few visits and we worked on his outline and his program and his delivery, and he was all excited. On our fourth visit I said, I want to revisit the humor issue. He said, you're kidding, right? I said, no, you have to understand, I'm not saying we'd make fun of anything about Wilkinson syndrome, but is there some humor in how we might look at stereotypes about researchers? He said, oh yeah, we're kind of a funny lot. I said, great. How about mistakes that were made along the way in the research, and we look back now and say, what were we thinking? He goes, I get it. There's room for humor around the edges of what we do. I said, right, as long as we don't make fun of anyone with Wilkinson syndrome. And it went great. He got applause. He got the only laughs pretty much in the whole conference from what I understand. So find ways to include humor. Your audience will almost always appreciate it. Okay, on to this week's interview. My guest today is Mike Robbins. Mike is the author of the recently released Nothing Changes Until You Do, A Guide to Self-Compassion and Getting Out of Your Own Way. He's a sought-after keynote speaker and media personality. His previous two books, Focus on the Good Stuff and Be Yourself, Everyone Else is Already Taken, has been translated into 14 different languages. Mike has been a guest on hundreds of TV and radio shows, including ABC News, the Oprah Radio Network, and NPR. He's been featured in Forbes, the Washington Post, Ladies' Home Journal, and the Wall Street Journal. He's even a regular contributor to Oprah.com and the Huffington Post. I'll say it again later, but for reference, you can learn more about Mike at mike-robbins.com, and that's with a double B, mike-robbins.com. On a personal note, I first met Mike about 10 years ago at a convention of the National Speakers Association, which we both belong to. I saw his star rising then, and it just blows me away, Mike, to keep watching all of your successes. Congratulations and welcome to Full Speech Ahead.
Thanks, Milo. Good to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Really honored to have you. So let's just give people who aren't familiar with you a little bit of background on how you came to be where you are, speaking nationally and writing these books, a little bit of the what got you here.
Yeah, well, I didn't start out in life with this as the plan, so to speak.
I don't know anyone who did.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, my focus for a lot of my life growing up was playing baseball, and that was my real passion. I was pretty good at it. I actually got drafted right out of high school by the New York Yankees. I didn't end up signing with the Yankees because I got an opportunity to play baseball at Stanford. Went to Stanford, played baseball there. Then I got drafted by the Kansas City Royals. And the way that it works in baseball is, I'm sure many people listening know, but you basically get drafted by a major league team, sign a pro contract like I did. You still have to go into the minor leagues, and there's a bunch of levels you have to sort of work your way up. And unfortunately for me, I was doing pretty well working my way up, but I went out to pitch one night, my third season in the minors with Kansas City, and I threw one pitch, and I tore ligaments in my elbow and blew my arm out. So that was basically, it didn't end like that day, but that was the beginning of the end, a few years of surgeries and rehab and trying to come back. But my baseball career ended. So I moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area where I'd grown up, Milo, and then did the internet.com thing in the late 90s after I got done playing baseball. And then after a few years in the .com world working for a few startups, I got laid off like so many other people did in the year 2000 when the .com bubble burst. And I always had this kind of secret fantasy, this secret passion, if you will, that I thought one day if I'd ever made it to the big leagues or was successful in some way in my life, I'd love to go and speak and talk to kids or people, or I didn't even know who or about what, but I just had this desire, and that was 14 years ago. And when you and I met a little over a decade ago at the National Speakers Association, I was just getting started in the sort of speaking, coaching world. And, thankfully, with a lot of help and support and luck and mentorship along the way, I've had some fun and had an opportunity to write a few books and be here today talking to you a little bit about my new book, Nothing Changes Until You Do, among other things.
So let's dive right into that, because although I could ask you about all your books, the new one is always the exciting one in your mind, I'm sure. So what inspired you to write the book?
Well, a couple of things. The book really focuses on three primary things. One is self-compassion, because I think most of us, myself included, are really, really hard on ourselves. So that was kind of the primary motivation, is I wanted to write a book that really addressed that and went kind of to delve into that a little more deeply. Secondly, there's a tendency that I know I have, and a lot of people that I talk to and work with, to get frustrated and to, resist what's happening in the moment. Is one of my favorite quotes from Byron Katie. She says, when you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time, right? So the second part of it is really about sort of, making peace with what is and what's going on. And the third part is really about, taking ownership for our lives. And for me, all three of these things, simple concepts, things that lots of people understand, myself included, but definitely things that at times I get tripped up by, as do a lot of people that I work with and talk to. So I really wanted to write the book, as I do with all my books and all my work, Milo. I always look at what am I both struggling with and what am I most interested in, and how can I more deeply sort of delve into that for myself personally. In the process, hopefully I'll learn a few things that I can share with other people that might help them.
When you say the things that you're struggling with, that's what inspires you to write the book?
Yeah, not struggling more just kind of grappling with. And this whole idea, the book is really about, self-compassion, our relationship with ourselves. And I have found that over the course of my life, back when I was playing baseball all those years, the years I worked in sales briefly in the .com world, and then all these years, the last 13 and a half or so as a speaker and an author and a coach, that most of the stuff that we do, even the stuff that seems really difficult, and this is true even in my personal life as a husband and a father of two girls, like the stuff itself, even like writing a book, just finishing this, is relatively easy. The hardest part, I think, is dealing with ourselves. Giving a speech, and you talk a lot about speaking and how to do that effectively. I think giving a speech, which you and I both been doing for many years, it's actually pretty easy. We know how to talk. The hard part is the nervousness and the craziness that goes on in our head and in our heart before we stand up to talk to the group about, oh, they're going to think I'm an idiot. What if I mess up? What if I forget? All that stuff. That's actually the harder part, I think, than even delivering the speech and figuring out what to say. It's that, how do we deal with the human aspect of it?
I often say to people that as a speaking coach, the reason we're so scared is there's something else we're good at, and that's why we're asked to speak. It's not because we were ever trained to speak, as if being good at something means you're good at speaking about it. And when we teach people how to be good at speaking about it, and they have that skill set, suddenly a lot of those nerves go away. But back to what you were saying about self-compassion. So how do you differentiate that from self-esteem?
Well, it's somewhat similar in certain ways, but actually quite distinct. There's a woman named Kristen Neff Dr. Kristen Neff, actually, who's a professor at the University of Texas, who I had the opportunity to interview recently myself. And her work, she wrote a book on self-compassion. She's actually one of the sort of world's leading experts in it, and she likes to distinguish it, whereas self-esteem is about sort of a global assessment of our relative value, thinking we're good or not so good at something, and self-compassion is more about actually having kindness and empathy for ourselves in the moment. So the difference being, again, I have to be good at something. I go give a speech. Was it good or bad? And my self-esteem is tied up in how I think I did relative to my potential relative to other people, whereas self-compassion is, can I be compassionate with myself regardless of how I evaluate how I do giving the speech as an example, or with the meeting, or with whatever we're working on. And I find self-esteem is absolutely important, but as a culture we've become obsessed so much with self-esteem that there are some negative aspects of it. We think we have to be exceptional or at least above average at everything or anything in order to think we're good and valuable, and that can be a bit of a trap because that's essentially impossible. And self-compassion is really about, again, building a relationship with ourselves so we can be kind and loving to ourselves, if you will, throughout all the ups and downs and twists and turns of life, which may sound simple, and it is a simple concept, but I know in my own practice of it and working with lots of people, it's no small thing, and actually it's quite difficult for a lot of us.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with you saying it sounds simple. The concept is simple.
Right.
But doing it is a lifetime of learning. So what's the implications for someone who has self-esteem but not self-compassion?
Well, there's a lot of us, I think, who have a decent amount of self-esteem but struggle with self-compassion in a certain way, and that tends to be hard-driving, type A, sort of never good enough perfectionist. You know, confidence, I can go do it, I can make it happen, but then again, make a mistake here, miss something there, fall down a little bit on, oh, no, what an idiot, you know, go really harsh on ourselves. And it's that gremlin, I like to call it, or that inner critic that tends to run the show for a lot of us. And unfortunately, and I've struggled with this over the course of my life as well, we somehow think that there's really something valuable in being so hard on ourselves. It keeps me on, I have an edge, it keeps me going, it pushes me, when in reality, as most of us have learned the hard way, it actually drains us and stresses us out. So building our self-esteem is absolutely important, but simultaneously being mindful of compassion for ourselves, being forgiving of ourselves, giving ourselves permission, as I talk about in the book, to make mistakes, actually gives us more freedom or more confidence to be creative and express ourselves in the way we want to.
I love that part of it. So given that we know better than anyone else how hard we've worked on something and how much we care about things, why are we harder on ourselves than anybody else?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a few reasons. I think a lot of us have been trained that way, either directly or indirectly. You know, we live in a culture where we see people, and many of us were raised by people who may have been really hard on themselves, if you will. You know, and I think about this a lot in parenting now with my girls, because it's like I can tell them something, but then they watch how I treat myself more than anything. And so it's not only what I say to them, but it's how I operate and interact with myself. And this is not to blame our parents, but that's one way we get raised. Secondly, I think, again, we live in a culture that's very hypercritical, and we get taught that that's how you become excellent at something, is be hard on yourself, be critical of yourself. You know, it gets celebrated. You know, Joe stayed up all night, and he never, you know, he's a perfectionist, and it's almost like celebrated. And whenever I hear that, I start to cringe, because I'm like, oh, that's actually really potentially damaging and detrimental. And I also think at some level, we place a lot of our value and worth on how we look, what we do, what other people say about us, all these things that are sort of external that we can't control. And that leaves us in this place of feeling like we have to constantly drive really hard towards perfection, because if my value and worth is based on something outside of myself, I have to constantly make sure it's perfect. Otherwise, then I'm flawed.
I love that. That was really cool. One of the things you said made me want to ask you some questions about vulnerability, but I'm looking at the clock. So when we get back from this quick break, we'll ask Mike how vulnerability fits into that whole scheme of the whole thing. We'll be back right after this.
Not another boring conference.
Liven it up with IMPROVentures and the fun of improvisation. Check out motivational speeches and entertainment that get everyone learning through play and laughter. For smaller groups, Teamprovising is our teamwork and communication program with more feedback and fun. Plus public dynamics, keynotes, training, and coaching on public speaking skills. You can be more effective in front of groups. Learn more today.
IMPROVentures, 619-542-0761, or see videos at IMPROVevents.com.
And we're back with Mike Robbins in the second segment. When we left off, I was asking you about vulnerability, and you write a lot about that in your book. So why is vulnerability so important?
Well, there's some really interesting research that's been coming out, Milo, in the last few years that I've been fascinated by. Many people are probably familiar with Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown from the University of Houston, who's had a couple of very successful TED Talks. And from a speaking standpoint, by the way, she's great to watch just because she's such a fabulous speaker. But her work is all about, she's really studied vulnerability and other human emotions. And what she's found in her work specifically is that vulnerability is the key driver in human connection and trust. So from a relational standpoint, it's fundamental. But also from a confidence standpoint, it really, we can't, as Brene likes to say, you can't get to courage without walking through vulnerability. So specifically, related to my book, but also to speaking, there's a number of stories I share in the book because I do so much speaking, but there's one in particular where I got hired by a client a few years ago, and this is a big insurance company, and it was kind of a big deal gig. It was sort of the president of one of their divisions, and it was a relatively small group, only 100 or less people, but it was his direct reports and sort of their directs. It was the senior leaders within this division of this larger company. At the time, probably the biggest, highest level meeting I'd ever spoken at. And they had told me about Bob, the president. They were like, look, he's not touchy-feely. He's very business specific, straightforward. They wanted me to come in and talk about appreciation. I had a call with Bob. I was all sort of set, and they were like, keep it really the numbers, the data, don't get into too much of the personal sort of touchy-feely stuff, because that's a bit of how I roll. Anyway, so I get up to give my speech, and I'm want to do, but I had asked if I could come early to kind of meet some people before I talked and sort of get a sense, because I was actually nervous about it. And my gut kept telling me, Milo, these people are really stressed. They actually need to cry, is what my intuition was telling me.
Whoa.
And I'm I'm fighting with myself, going, okay, no, there would be no crying. Don't screw this up, Rob. It's it's this.
There's no crying in baseball.
Exactly, no crying. So
or
anyway,
business.
Exactly. I get up to speak, and I start to give my presentation, and it's fine. I have an hour, and it's going pretty well, but it's it's not really resonating the way that I want it to, and I'm not really trusting my own gut and my own intuition. I'm trying to do what I'm supposed to do. Anyway, long story short, about halfway through, I sort of switch gears. I have them pair up and start talking a little bit more personally. I start sharing some more personal stories. Things start to open up. It starts to go a little bit better. It starts to resonate more, and towards the end, I can now feel there's all this emotion in the room. People have shared some stuff. I start to tell this story at the end of my speech that I know if I tell this story, it's kind of an emotional story. It could potentially get emotional in the room. I'm literally 30 seconds into it. More than half the people in the room are crying. Oof. And it was less about it was just the moment. It was and I tell it, but not Bob, right? He's not crying, and he's looking pretty pained, right? And then I get done, and Bob walks up to say something after me, doesn't acknowledge me, doesn't say anything, nothing. And I'm thinking, oh no, maybe I screwed this up. I sit down, and Bob starts to talk, and he's kind of all flustered and starts to tell a story about someone that he really appreciated, who'd really helped him through a tough time. And then Bob starts to cry. And the room gets kind of a little shocked, oh God. And I look around and I'm like, uh-oh. I still don't know if that's a good or bad thing. He kind of wraps up. The meeting ends a little bit awkwardly, but more just kind of people are stunned. And then the head of HR who had hired me grabs me by the arm and pulls me out of the room. And I'm still sort of in a bit of a whirlwind wondering, what just happened? And he looks me right in the eye and he says, 6 years. 6 years we've been waiting for him to show up like that. And he finally did it today. And
you're lucky you had an HR director who saw that as a positive.
It's true. I mean, it was a risk. But here's the thing. They've become a huge client of mine. And Bob, actually loves me. And literally when I see him, he's like, hey, there's Mike. That's the guy that made me cry. It's turned into this kind of thing. But I share that because a lot of times for us, whether we're speaking, whether we're meeting with people, whatever we're doing, being ourselves, being real, and creating the opportunity, opening the space where people have the permission to be vulnerable, one of the most powerful things we can do.
You not only gave them permission to be vulnerable, but you were being very, very vulnerable. I'm not sure how many people in our audience give presentations like you and I do, but to say, I'm going to risk a huge client here by going with my instinct rather than what I've been told is what is expected of me. That took a lot of vulnerability on your part, but clearly the payoff was there. I think 9 out of 10 times when we follow our instincts, they turn out to be right, but
Absolutely.
Someone else is scared to let us. That's always the tough one. So you were vulnerable there. The client was. Do you find when people are reacting to your book and to the material that you've used and your other books that have led up to this, that fear of vulnerability just becomes a roadblock for some people? How do they break that down?
It's practice, and we got to find our own level of comfort. I mean, I tend to write and speak in a way that's very open and transparent and expressive. And again, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, but vulnerability is really about pushing up to our edge, Milo, wherever it is, and being willing to step past the edge. It's stepping through the fear. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to expose ourselves and share lots of deep, dark secrets or whatever. I mean, that's one sliver of it, if you will, but it's really being willing to take risks. I mean, look, vulnerability is really the birthplace of creativity, innovation, and change. If we're not willing to be vulnerable, if we have to have everything controlled, we have to have everything mapped out and figured out, very difficult to really create something or take the next step, whatever that may be in our evolution.
And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I'm always telling people on the pendulum scale, where 10 is just, reading your diary to the audience as far as you can just, if you're at a 2, try 3. 3 might be a big, step in the right direction. One of the things you also talk about is surrender. How does that fit into this?
Well, surrendering, again, is about, as I was talking about in the first segment, it's about accepting things as they are. It's not about giving up. It's not about throwing the towel in. It's just about allowing life or situations or circumstances to be as they are. And oftentimes when things aren't going the way we want them to, we fight against it, we push against it, we're unwilling to surrender, and that actually creates more conflict and more challenge for us than just allowing things to be. A lot of times you get into an argument with someone or you have something you're stressed about or frustrated about. If you can actually surrender to it, it's like an emotion. You let it come through you. It'll move through you and pass. If you hold on or fight it or avoid it, it oftentimes sticks around and causes a lot more problems.
I like that. And so with that, how do we be more kind and loving toward ourselves to allow that surrender to happen without it being crippling?
Well, I think, again, it's a practice, and one of the things we can start paying attention to is how do we talk about ourselves, because that's our thoughts manifested out loud. And if you listen to yourself and we listen to each other, we often say lots of mean and critical things. I remember years ago, Michelle, my wife, and I had this great conversation. We were just started dating, and I was frustrated with myself, and I was saying a lot of negative, critical things about myself. I wasn't even totally conscious about it, but she stopped me and she said, "Hey, don't talk about my boyfriend like that." And I said, "What? What do you mean?" And she said, "Listen, just because you're you doesn't give you the right to talk about yourself like that. If someone else were talking about you like that, I would be upset and offended. And I don't want to hear you talk about yourself like that because I love you and care about you." And so if we can talk to ourselves and about ourselves, even internally, as though we would talk about someone we really love and care about, it would shift the context of how we relate to ourselves. And remember, we're somebody's brother, we're somebody's son, we're somebody's spouse, we're somebody's friend. We're important people in people's lives, and we got to remember that in how we relate to ourselves.
I've never met Michelle, but I know people who have met her, and that story explains to me why they're so impressed with her. That's a great story.
She's awesome, man. She's the best. I'm very, very grateful and fortunate to have married such an incredible woman.
That's great. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk, because we ended up on a high note, let's go low. I want to talk about some of the challenges you've had. I know in the book you deal with death and loss and financial challenges you've had. So when we get back from this break, we're going to look into some of the things that helped you have some of the realizations you had. We'll be right back after this.
Got photos that need improvement? Freshen your photo. Old family shots that have gotten damaged? Freshen your photo. Want someone or something removed from a picture? Freshen your photo. At freshenyourphoto.com, we turn the pictures you have into the pictures you want. Add muscle, lose weight, lighten face lines, whiten teeth, fix darker off-color shots. See before and afters from dozens of happy customers at freshenyourphoto.com. That's freshenyourphoto.com.
We're back with the final segment on my interview with Mike Robbins, and once again, his website, www.mike-robbins.com with 2 B's. Mike, when we left off, I was just about to ask you about some of the challenges that you faced that have led up to you writing the book. So I'm just going to kind of let you talk on that rather than asking questions.
Yeah, well, I share a bit about this in the introduction and throughout the book. I mean, one of the reasons that I wrote this book and a lot of what I've learned in the last 5 years is there's been lots of ups and lots of downs and some very specific challenges in my life. One of them, probably most poignantly, was the death of my mom back in 2011. And the first chapter of the book and the last chapter of the book, I specifically kind of go into some of that. And one of the things, Milo, she died middle of 2011. She got diagnosed with lung cancer in March and died in June. So it was very quick and it was very sudden in lots of ways. But as I'm sure many people who are listening can relate to, as difficult and painful as it was, there were so many blessings that came out of that whole experience. And I really felt, just like I'd felt when my father passed away about 13 years ago, I learned so much and felt so honored to get to experience that with them. And in each case, of course, I didn't want it to happen at all, but there it was. And talk about surrendering to something even when you don't want it to happen. But one of the things, I was running in my neighborhood that I grew up in about a month after my mom got diagnosed, and she was getting pretty sick, and it was becoming clear, like, wow, this is serious, and it's probably going to go this way. And I'm on this run, and I'm all this emotion, and I had this thought in my head, I wonder what it's like for my mom knowing that she's going to die. Like, I just wonder what that's like. And then I stopped myself running. I went, wait a minute. I know I'm going to die. And it was like this really basic but profound realization. I went, wait a minute. I don't live like that. I don't think most of us do. Most people don't get, or hope we don't get the diagnosis, the conversation that my mother had with the doctor that, like, hey, you have terminal cancer. And as awful as that was, it was like there were some incredible things that showed up in conversations and situations and things that happened between me and her and our family that were remarkable. But all of a sudden it made me realize every single one of us, whether we live to be 110 or our lives are much shorter, we have an opportunity to live life for however long it is. And we all know at some point the physical experience of life is going to end. And I think for so many things, whether it's our fear of public speaking, whether it's afraid to ask someone for a date or, a piece of business or whatever, some risk we want to take, some vulnerability as we were talking about before, it's like, it's like what Steve Jobs talked about in that great speech that he gave at Stanford back in 2005 that now is even more poignant since he passed away. It's like, he said, knowing you're going to die is like the greatest gift of life because you realize you have nothing to lose. You're already naked, like you're already exposed. And so at some level, one of the main reasons I wrote this book and what I believe is so true for all of us, if we can embrace that in a healthy way, not in a freaked out, paranoid way, but just embrace the fact that life isn't forever and do it consciously. It changes the way we work. It changes the way we interact with the people we love. It changes the way we relate to life in general. And I actually think it's one of the most empowering things we can do as human beings.
I don't even know how to follow that up except to say good thing we're running out of time because I can't follow that with anything. I can follow it with this. If you find Mike as mesmerizing as I do, you're going to love the book. I think that you're going to see that touches that we have here from it are throughout the book and so much more. So, Mike, I want to thank you for being a guest today on Full Speech Ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet. I also want to let my listeners know that they can learn more about anything Mike has been saying here and so much more at www.mike-robbins.com. They can also get his book by going to Mike's website or by going directly to Amazon.com. And the book title, again, is Nothing Changes Until You Do. If you've enjoyed this episode live, it'll be on my website for replay by tomorrow so you can share it with others, along with many of the other interviews I've done and keep posted at fullspeechahead.com. If you'd like to get notices of other upcoming Full Speech Ahead shows and more tips on public speaking and creating a more playful life, sign up for my newsletter at miloshapiro.com. And you can check out that same site for information about my coaching and training in public speaking for you or your work team. I'm also available for my team building course, Teamprovising, where we use games of improvisation to look at teamwork, creativity, and communication. And my motivational speeches on risk, like Mike was talking about, take the whole audience playing along and make it a lot of fun. More on that at miloshapiro.com. With that, I am Milo Shapiro, always moving full speech ahead. Till next time.
Not another boring conference.
Liven it up with IMPROVentures and the fun of improvisation. Check out motivational speeches and entertainment that get everyone learning through play and laughter. For smaller groups, Teamprovising is our teamwork and communication program with more feedback and fun. Plus public dynamics, keynotes, training, and coaching on public speaking skills. You can be more effective in front of groups. Learn more today.
IMPROVentures, 619-542-0761, or see videos at IMPROVevents.com.
Got photos that need improvement? Freshen your photo. Old family shots that have gotten damaged? Freshen your photo. Want someone or something removed from a picture? Freshen your photo. At freshenyourphoto.com, we turn the pictures you have into the pictures you want. Add muscle, lose weight, lighten face lines, whiten teeth, fix darker off-color shots. See before and afters from dozens of happy customers at freshenyourphoto.com. That's freshenyourphoto.com.